Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Sven Faulconer. Over the course of his career, which spans almost 15 years, Sven has written the music for films, TV shorts and documentaries. Before starting his solo career, Sven has learned the ropes and perfected his craft working for one of the best composers of all time, James Newton Howard, collaborating with him on films such as The Hunger Games, Snow White and the Huntsman, The Bourne Legacy, and many more. Ever since, Sven has shown his versatility and massive skills writing music for projects such as Bloodfather, We the Marines, and National Geographic documentaries such as Cape Horn and Into the Okavango, which we will also discuss in detail. Welcome back, Sven.
Oh, wow. Hey, Michael, how you doing? I love your introductions, man.
Thank you, thank you. I'm good. Hope you're good too, and glad you like my introduction.
How's it going, man? It's always a pleasure.
Great, great to have you back here. Sven, before we dive into your career as a composer, please tell me again a bit about your musical education, how you started out in Los Angeles.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in Belgium, and I started taking music classes at the academy in my hometown, Ossa, at the age of 6, I guess. And then my instrument then was clarinet. I obviously got introduced to reading music and playing in orchestra, and I started composing music from a relatively young age because we had my dad had an Apple in like '92, which was kind of unusual, I guess, but it ran a very early version of Cubase. So when I was 12, I got my first couple of uh, hours of experience in a sequencer, and that's when I started kind of experimenting with composition. And then later on, I studied electrical engineering, something very different. But as I was doing that, I was writing a lot of music, and I played in a funk band, and I founded a symphony orchestra at the university of where I studied in Belgium. And then at some point, after I had worked as an engineer for a couple of years, my wife and I were able to move to the United States through work, and then that's when I really started going to a whole bunch of film festivals, and I started taking a UCLA extension class in film scoring, and I kind of really got exposed to the LA film composers scene. And then eventually I started interning at Mark Streitenfeld's when he was doing Robin Hood, and that was in 2009, and that's when I really started taking it very seriously and doing it full time. And then from there onwards, the rest is history, I guess.
You just mentioned Robin Hood, which was scored by Mark Streitenfeld, and you had worked on the project also as a scoring assistant. Tell me a bit about your early days in the business and how you learned the ropes.
Well, it was very exciting. I had so little knowledge of what's involved in a big film music studio because you simply don't have the gear to learn. So my internship at Mark Streitenfeld's was a lot of, silly little tasks. But then I also got to spend a lot of time with some of the other assistants, and obviously I got to know Mark and kind of see how he went from start to finish and see how everything got prepared for it. Scoring it got scored at Abbey Road. I had to ship all the gear to London. So I really got to see a lot of different parts of the whole scoring process. And I had a lot of experience running the software that you use, the sequencer that you use to write music, but I didn't have any Pro Tools experience, which is also one of the main tools out there. And so I had my first basic lessons in Pro Tools, and it was just an overall great experience, an introduction to film scoring.
As I understand, from that point on, you had started working with James Newton Howard in about 2010.
Uh-huh, correct.
Uh, how did your collaboration with James come about?
Well, so I'd done a couple of other interesting gigs after working for Mark Steinfeld, and then at some point I kind of had to make a decision. Well, I definitely want to keep doing this full time because it's just too much fun. So I was kind of considering a couple of different avenues, and I played around with a couple of different ways of going about it. But pretty quickly, I decided, well, I really kind of want to work for one of these A-list guys because I think that's where you really you have to work hard, but you learn the process in the right way. You see how the big guys do it, and then you hopefully adapt a lot of that in your own process. And so that was kind of my approach. And I basically called like my 10 favorite film composers, whichever ones I could get contact info for their studios. And, that I remember well, the day I called James's studio was kind of towards the end of their search for a second assistant. And so the studio manager told me, well, you're in luck. Today's kind of like the last day that we're getting resumes, and then we're going to start the interviewing process. So if you send me your resume, we'll put it on the pile and see if you're worth our time. And so that's kind of how that happened. And then I met back then, James's team, and I got hired. I was able to show decent chops in their sequencer, and then I was very honest about my limited experience in Pro Tools, but I'd prepared so I could show them some basic stuff that I knew that was very relevant for film scoring, and I got hired. It was one of the most special moments really since I moved to LA. And then just working with Stu Thomas was amazing because he'd already been doing this for a while, so he knew the process very well. It took me, quite a while. It took me maybe 2 years before I really was confident enough to kind of become James's first assistant. That's the amount of time it took for me to really kind of learn the process and be comfortable with literally every aspect of the studio, including all the gear, just how James likes to work, how things need to get prepared for orchestration, for getting everything ready at the scoring stage, to evaluating mixes and working with the mixers and their engineers. So it was an amazing experience. It was kind of like a mentorship in a way. It was really cool.
You had worked with James on so many projects. I mean, the Hunger Games and the Bourne Legacy, Nightcrawler, Snow White and the Huntsman, Maleficent, Fantastic Beasts, and many more. What do you think was the most essential lesson you had learned and experienced when working with James Sudenhard?
It's tough to just pick one. Like, there's a couple of things I thought were really important. The first thing that comes to mind, really, the first thing that I was really impressed by was James's work ethic. And seeing an A-list guy like that, seeing how he handles, rewrites, and when he gets feedback from the director was an amazing lesson, because you would think, wow, the guy at that level, I guess he must get everything right from the first time, and I guess the director should just be happy that he gets to work with a guy like this. But he's such a pro about, that's a big part of film scoring, is actually, how good you are at the rewrite, and just seeing, everyone gets projects where they get to rewrite a cue 40 times. And just seeing that, and seeing how dedicated he was about that, and how that just didn't faze him, and he didn't see it as a problem. It's just, that's what the gig is, and if you can't handle that, then you're not going to be happy being a film composer, because it's a really big part of the gig. And just seeing a guy at that level never complain about that, and just seeing it as a natural thing of trying to find the right thing for this director, for this particular story, it was kind of a really great lesson. Also, obviously, the process, I learned a lot. He's very efficient. He's been doing it for so long, so and just like a lot of the other A-list guys, the process is a little different in every studio, but they all know what they're doing, and it's been working for them. So I think it's a great place to learn how you get stuff done efficiently and get it ready on time, and don't have anything unexpected happen that could put your scoring session on hold, and now there's 80 musicians waiting for parts or something like that. That type of stuff would never happen at James's studio. So that was a big part of working for him. And also, being able to be a fly on the wall during meetings, and seeing how he would interact with directors and producers, and understanding the different dynamics from one project to another, because it is different on every movie. So he's, being a successful film composer is in part obviously being a great composer. It's also being great at interpreting the feedback you're getting from a director, and you know, writing a relevant redo of a cue. It's also about being comfortable around people, and just being able to manage the different dynamics of how a specific movie is organized from a production standpoint. Who has which role, all that stuff. So I got a very full education at the studio for sure.
You just mentioned the reader rights. I mean, probably this affects every composer out there. I mean, it's if there are so many people involved, producers, directors, executives, and so many, it's pretty hard to please everyone with your first approach or first cue. So I think it must be pretty nerve-wracking at times to really make sure everybody is pleased and to find a common ground.
Well, that's interesting. I feel, obviously I'm at the very beginning of my career, but I've definitely already felt a change from when I started doing this 10 years ago. At first, it was the problem. It's always like fun when your cue gets approved in version 1. That's a great feeling. But obviously, it rarely happens, or, it oftentimes happens that you have to do rewrites. But I've become more comfortable with the feeling you get when you have to do a rewrite, because it used to be an annoying feeling, and it's become less of that. So the only time it really gets frustrating for experienced composers, I think, is when it's starting to affect when you're getting close to the time that you need to be scoring the movie, or when you're seeing like, man, we are just not getting this thing approved, or it's a matter of finding the right palette for this movie. When it's part of a bigger problem that you're not finding the solution for, then it can get stressful. Yeah, it's true. Sometimes there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and sometimes it's harder than other times. You just hope that the ideal scenario is that there's one guy who calls the shots, and that's the director. But in reality, there's a lot of influences around that person, and there's creative people around that. There's the picture editor who has a lot of influence and a lot of usually, interesting thoughts on the scores. So you have to make sure that those people are part of the process, and that you can do demos in time, and that you can get all the necessary feedback. It gets especially tricky when all of a sudden towards the end of the process, new people get involved, and there are new thoughts that are simply because how the studio is structured. All of a sudden, these are very relevant thoughts, and now it affects your timeline, and you have to start rewriting stuff, which is fine. But you have to make sure that if your scoring date and the release date aren't moving, the deadlines don't change. So that can be stressful.
Sven, fantastic piece. You had worked on this picture with James Newton Howard, which I think is one of his greatest achievements of recent times. You had worked really closely with him on that picture, and on top of that, you also produced the score and the album. Could you tell me a bit about the work process on this particular film and how you pulled off this project?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, but it was a pretty involved process from a technical standpoint, because James wanted to be in London on that movie, and so we had decided that James had decided that for 3 months he was going to be in London. So it meant that we wanted 2 functional systems. So basically, all the gear you need to write music, it's a pretty involved setup. So we we needed two of those because, James was obviously writing the score, and then, whatever we were doing, we needed our own system. So we rented a space in London through his friend Hans Zimmer, and so we set up two systems in London. So we had to ship one from LA. So that was a kind of a new one for us to like ship all the gear there and get it all up and running. And it was really nice. The director was working very near to the studio where we were located. So he, when things were happening fast, he would come by sometimes 2 or 3 times a day to listen to new stuff. And it was a very close collaboration between the director and James. But it was a long process. It took, he was there for 3 months. So he took it very, just like any project of his, he took it very seriously, and he gave it his all, and he gave it all his time and dedication. So it was a pretty remarkable result in the end. I thought that was a really great score.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my all-time favorites of his, and I still love the album. I've listened to it a number of times. So as an album and as a total listening experience, the first Fantastic Beasts is still, one of my top 10 James Newton Howard scores.
Wow, nice.
Sven, after that, or in between, you had started working on a film, Bloodfather, starring Mel Gibson, which was one of your first big solo gigs. And
Right.
did you feel you had to improvise a lot on that picture to get the job done, or did you try to apply what you had learned prior to this project at a certain point?
The director was, it was one of the funny things about Bloodfather is that it didn't want to have a strong theme or anything like that. So I remember that 2 of the most important moments in that film, it were the 2 last cues that we figured out. And it was basically one of the very things I had written in the beginning that I'd intended for the opening of the movie, which was back then was slightly different. And it didn't end up getting used, and we'd kind of forgotten about the piece. And then we were kind of figuring out, because I was kind of scoring the emotional moments more traditionally with, strings and kind of, just trying to help that emotion. And the director wasn't quite digging that. And it was interesting because then I just was playing this silly piece that I'd written at the very beginning that was for a kind of an emotional moment at the beginning of the film. And he's like, damn, that's yeah, what is that? I'm like, well, that's the cue I wrote for the scene. And he really liked that. And it wasn't really, it's not thematic, but you could consider it kind of being, it's basically just 4 chords. So there's not even a melody line, but it was just interesting to see how towards the end of the project, all of a sudden the director had such a strong response to that. And it was very understated. It wasn't really telling the audience how to feel, and it kind of worked well for that particular movie.
You've been working independently for some time now. What was your primary motivation to do so?
Well, I'd been working as James's right-hand man for 6 years. 5 years by the time I decided I wanted to move on independently. In a way, because I just wanted to write more music. And I also felt that, I'd learned so much with James. And I just started feeling more anxious about starting to focus more on my own projects. I was starting to get a couple more of my own projects. So it was a combo of feeling that I wanted to move on and kind of gain more experience in working on my own projects, as well as seeing that there was enough in my pipeline, that I had enough projects to work on. So it was kind of I kind of gradually came to the point where I felt ready to do that. And there's a lot of stuff that you learn as assisting a guy like James over a period of time of 5 or 6 years. But if you kind of look at some of the other assistants and kind of when they moved on, that seems to be kind of the amount of time where a lot of people seem to feel like, oh, I think I want to move on, and it's been an interesting experience because there was obviously a very big shift moving from being an employee at a studio to actually being self-employed and dealing with all that and building a studio and all that stuff. So it's been an amazing experience, but also what I see is building a steady flow of work takes time. It's not like you can just all of a sudden leave some studio that you've been working at and then expect tons of directors to flock your way and having an abundance of projects to work on. So I noticed that the process of building kind of your network of people you've worked with and hopefully doing a good enough job that they're coming back to do other projects with you is just a time-consuming and slowly evolving part of a composer's career. And I think I'm kind of I'm happy that I moved on, and I think it was a good time for me to kind of start gaining more experience doing my own stuff, and I'm seeing, after having done it now for 3 years, I'm seeing kind of how things are progressing, and it seems to be kind of the way it goes for a lot of composers who kind of move on independently. It's a gradual process, and you get, hopefully, you grow the number of people that come back and work with you. It's been a very interesting experience so far.
You worked on several mediums. I mean, films, short films, and also National Geographic productions and documentaries. Do you have a certain formula as to how to approach each medium?
Not really. I feel like the formula, I think every project ends up giving me a different formula, and I think a lot of it depends. I think a lot of it depends on who I'm working with and how they like to work. For instance, some projects are very hands-off, and you get far less feedback, and things get approved very easily, and that kind of defines your process in that case. You just, but on other projects, like the National Geographic documentary Into the Okavango was almost a 1-year process, and it was very interesting because the director had a very clear idea of what the music needed to do as far as how it should support the story. So, and he was a film music fan, and so there was a lot of interesting things that we talked about as far as some of the temp music that had been in there, and it was a very different process than some of the hands-off projects I've worked on, and it was a very interesting, intriguing process because it took us some time to find the sound that worked for that documentary, but in the end, it was kind of, for me at least, a sound that I had never really used before, and who knows, I might not ever use it again, but it seemed to, the director really liked it and it seemed to work well with the way he was trying to tell the story. And then also, the way the story was told kind of changed too, because the original cut was kind of approaching the documentary from a different angle. So it was interesting how what originally got approved and in the end made it into the film was very different. So, unfortunately, there was not a way, I could not have seen any of this coming on any of the projects. So it's just kind of a process of learning as you go and seeing how different people get used to specific pieces of music in their film. And it's kind of different for every director I've worked with.
People in the industry always, or many times, state that deadlines for a TV series, for instance, are even much tougher than writing for a film. What is the situation like when working on a National Geographic documentary?
So again, there I think it probably varies, but so far I've done 2 different things for National Geographic, and one was a kind of a shorter film, and then there was Into the Aquavango, which is a feature film, and it was very different. Like with Into the Aquavango, the director had a lot of freedom as far as, you know, the amount of time he had and which festivals they were going to submit to, and that kind of changed over time as well. So I never really felt that there was a huge amount of pressure from the start of the project, because we knew we had a lot of time. So it was kind of nice in a way, because we could experiment with a lot of different ideas, and we could kind of take our time, and it took us a long time to kind of find the right sound, but luckily we had that amount of time. On the other stuff, the Pristine Seas stuff I've been doing was much faster paced and kind of much easier. It was a way more traditional way of scoring a film. So we kind of found our approach there much more quickly. It was but you know, it took only, you know, I only had a couple of weeks to finish all that, and luckily, you know, it was a relatively smooth process, but very different. Those two documentaries were very different. So I can only imagine, you know, I'm sure there's a lot of other National Geographic documentaries out there with other directors and other departments. I'm sure they're all kind of like, they have their unique timelines and different amounts of pressure and specifics.
Neil Gelinas directed Into the Okavango, and what exactly is important to the filmmaker or to the filmmakers for this particular project? What were they looking for in terms of music?
Well, I guess you can talk about different ways you can support the storytelling. And if I would try to summarize what the score has to do Into the Okavango, is in a very subtle way, because the story isn't a classic Hollywood story, right? It's basically about what this expedition is trying to find out in this amazing wetland area in that spans Namibia, Angola, and Botswana, and it's one of the largest river systems, and it's the home for, you know, one of the largest number of elephants and hippos, and it's a spectacular area in Africa that hasn't really been it hasn't been studied. Like there's not a lot of studies out there that monitor kind of how the species have been evolving in numbers over the last 20 or 30 years. So there's not a lot of data. So that was kind of the goal of the expedition, was to gather this data. And so they decided they were going to go from the source river, which there's a couple of different rivers that end in this delta system, but they started at the source of the Kwidu River and ended up in the Okavango Delta. So that was one part of the story. But then the other part of the story is there's basically three main characters that they're following through this expedition. Well, it's obviously a large crew of like 20 or 25 people, I think. But there is Steve Boyce, who was really the expedition leader. He's kind of the scientific leader, I guess. And then there was Ajani, who was one of the scientists who was on this expedition. And then there was a guy who's nicknamed Mr. Water, who was kind of one of the what you call the pullers, the guys who kind of ride the boats, because they were obviously on these okonoros, which are these boats, these narrow canoe-like boats. And just one, you know, a guy who is from the Okavango Delta. So it's all these three storylines going through the main story, which is what they're achieving and what their results are, obviously. But you kind of connect to those three people as well, and you get to know them better. And they're three very different people with very different backgrounds. And so it's you know, the pace it's not like the pace of a Hollywood story. So you get to know these people very gradually, and the score had to kind of, you know, in a way, not necessarily help people tell them how they were supposed to feel, because the director was very adamant about, you know, let the audience figure out how they want to feel about what's being told here. But there is definitely a certain, you know, a cue could be described by a couple different adjectives, as far as like whether they should feel warm or whether they should connect people to, you know, what this person is going through at a specific point in time in the documentary. So, but in a very subtle way. Like if you would listen to the music, it's it's not in your face like, ooh, I think something very dramatic is happening here. There's a couple of cues like that, because at some point, at a couple of points in the documentary, there are some really dramatic things, but in general, it's basically kind of more of a general feeling, possibly, but not really in your face like, ooh, this is something sad, or this sounds very suspenseful.
Did you send the filmmakers certain sounds at first, or did you send them or present them final cues to begin with?
I sent them even before I saw a little trailer before I got the cut, and I started writing straight away. And none of that stuff got used. So I was approaching it very, and like I said, the documentary kind of went through different phases as well, like the cut. So at the beginning, a traditional approach with very dramatic orchestral score seemed to be the right way to go. But, it just didn't work for the documentary. It didn't work where it was heading when it was getting recut too. And the temp was interesting, because the temp, which is basically the music that is being cut as they're, screening the movie for different people, they're obviously not going to screen it without any music. So before a composer starts on this, on the score, they'll screen a movie with music from other movies cut into the picture. The temp kind of evolved too. Like the way he thought the temp had to kind of support the storytelling kind of changed. So it was kind of an interesting process, because, like I said in the beginning, the music kind of was quite different. And we did it's interesting. We did a whole recording session with string players in the beginning. That was very. It wasn't orchestral really. It was kind of more small ensemble, and it was kind of. We had a viola da gamba and some kind of weird old medieval sounding string instruments. And so we did a whole session there, and eventually, as he was recutting the movie, all that stuff which had been approved kind of got thrown out. And then, interestingly enough, towards the end, when the movie had changed quite a bit, some of that music made it back in. So it was an interesting process. Stuff that, had been approved and then got recorded and then got thrown out, made it into the final movie, which obviously I was very excited about, because it's a very unique kind of a unique sound that we came up with. But, I couldn't have seen any of this coming. I couldn't have predicted that the stuff that got thrown out would make it back in. And in the end, I guess we came up with kind of a minimalist score, meaning, kind of repetitive and using different instruments in very specific registers. The director always used to say high highs and low lows, and it sounds like such a simple thing. It sounds like such a simple thing to kind of achieve, but it was a very specific thing. And indeed, there's a lot of movement in the higher register. We're using flutes and strings, and then we're using effects like delays and stuff. So in the end, on some of these cues, you end up with something that sounds like a synth pad, but it's really a lot of movement of acoustic instruments that are being delayed, so you don't always recognize them as being acoustic instruments, but it creates this kind of movement in the higher register. And then there's a lot of lower synth and bass stuff, and sometimes low percussion happening, and there's not that much going on in the mid-range. So, but it's kind of minimalist and kind of repetitive, and very gradually changing chords, but it's not really thematic, or it's not really doing any of the stuff that you would see in kind of a traditional film score.
When people watch Into the Okavango, what do you think they should feel or learn from the story?
Well, it's been really cool. So when the documentary premiered at Tribeca in New York, people from the consulate from Namibia, I believe, came and they signed a treaty with stating that they were going to intend to work on some of the issues that were found by this expedition, and then it actually premiered a couple days ago in LA, and they did a Skype session with two of the main characters, Steve and Ajani, and it just in those couple of months, how much already has changed, and how much. Because a treaty can mean many different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to change. But just hearing the two protagonists of the documentary tell the audience kind of what has happened in the meanwhile was really impressive. So, I'm not going to give away kind of the stuff they found out, but it's definitely an interesting documentary because it shows you some of these issues that I'm sure are also happening in other areas that are hugely important to the planet and desperately need protection. And I feel like the documentary does a very good job of showing these issues and showing how this crew had no idea what was really happening in this Delta River system, although they could see that numbers were going down and animals seemed to be migrating to different areas and not doing it as well. So yeah, you learn a lot about kind of issues that in nature that are happening there. You're learning a lot about some of the political issues that are happening or have been happening, and some of the industrial issues, and then just some interesting findings. I think they found 4 new species of fish that only live in that particular area. They found out stuff they didn't know about how the river system works and kind of where the water is being held before it turns into a river. And it's just been it's been a very interesting way to tell a story of these groups of scientists and see them struggle with these boats and being attacked by hippos. And so they went through a lot. It was a 120-day excursion, and hopefully the goal is to make people care more about wildlife and understand kind of why it's important to protect certain areas, and also see kind of what could be a good way to approach the problem and solve the problem, which it's not easy because it involves a lot of local people who are just trying to make ends meet. And so you have to think about, well, how are we going to solve the problems and have it not become a problem for people who actually live there and depend on this area for their livelihoods.
Did you actually get to produce the album by yourself again? Did you hand pick the cues for the album presentation?
Yeah. So I thankfully got the support from National Geographic, and they let me use the logo, and they helped me with the artwork. But I discussed it with the director, and I remember months before the movie got released, we were talking about some of the other scores that he particularly liked, and he said how frustrating for film fans it is to have watched the movie and really like the music, and then look up the album and not find that one particular piece of music that he's crazy about. So he's a film music lover, and so that made me kind of think, well, there's 2 ways I could release the music, because there's always cues that a composer will find more interesting, or maybe the audience, and then there's others that maybe aren't that crucial. So, in this case, I decided to kind of include more than less, simply because I know the director kind of has more like, well, why wouldn't you just release all the music that was in there? And so we had some discussions about that, thinking like, well, maybe we should just get the most relevant tracks, so you have 12 tracks. But in the end, it ended up being, I think it's like a 25-track album. So there's a lot of stuff there, and I don't know if everybody's gonna listen through the entire album, but at least for people who want to, it's there so they can. And so that was my approach on this one, which doesn't mean that I think that's the approach you should take on every soundtrack release. Obviously, everyone has their own way of their own opinions about it.
You use some very unique sounds for this score. How much time did you actually spend on programming synthesizers and electronics on this one?
A lot, 90% of the time. Although we did we did do a lot of recording sessions with soloists, but it was a big part of it because even the stuff that got recorded got processed, and so the programming and the synths were a very essential part of the score. I would say probably 80 or 90% of it, and then on this one especially, let's say there's an hour of music in this, or maybe say 40 minutes. I maybe wrote
I'm not talking about rewrites, but completely different approaches. Must have written, probably 3 hours of music that was very different sounding. So it was a long and interesting process, and a lot of music. I'd written a lot of music, and some of it wasn't synthy at all. So, but in the end, the music that made it into the documentary, yeah, was very intensely programmed and very heavily processed, and using a lot of live elements and a lot of sample elements that then get delayed, etc. So it was a big part of the process.
Is there going to be a physical CD as well?
I don't think so. I haven't given it a lot of thought, to be honest, but I don't think we're going to do a physical release. I guess, I haven't really talked to a lot of people about that, so I haven't really given it a lot of thought, to be honest.
If you could give any advice to another composer, what would it be?
I guess for a composer who's getting into this, I would probably say try to find a way to spend as much time around anything related to film scoring, whichever way you can, whether it's scoring as many films you can get your hands on, or doing like I did, working for another composer, because that's definitely a great way to learn. But there's many other ways of beginning in this industry. There's a lot of composers who've become very successful directly scoring films themselves, and that's how they figured out their process. So there's many different ways, but I guess what's true for anyone who eventually kind of does a lot of work in this industry, they've done a lot of movies and they've scored a lot of hours of film, and they've just continuously gotten better at it, and they've tweaked their process, and so I think that's what I would say is try to do as much writing the picture as you can, whether it's films, video games, or documentaries, TV, whatever you can get your hands on. Definitely, I would highly recommend it.
Sven, you had also recently been involved with some other big productions, for instance, Aquaman. Could you tell me a bit about this project?
Yeah, that was a really exciting collaboration. So I've been Rupert Gregson Williams did the score for that, and so I guess early this year I got asked by Rupert if I wanted to do additional music on the movie, and it was kind of a big deal because I built my own studio, and it was kind of a lengthy process to kind of from start to end, because I wanted to do it right, and it kind of became more involved than I originally thought. And but it was pretty cool because by the time I got on Aquaman, I had just moved to my new studio space, so it was kind of a very cool test of my new space and kind of my new rig and my new system. But it was a lot of fun because there's a lot of orchestra involved, and there's a lot of on this one particularly a lot of synth programming that's really cool. That Rupert decided that the score had to have all these edgy synths in them and kind of combine that with big, large orchestral sound. And it was just kind of an exciting first project for me to be doing from my new studio space. And it was just kind of a blast working with Rupert and his team and then getting to write on a movie of that size. That was really cool.
Could you already give me some insight on some of your other most recent projects, like Replicate, for instance?
Yeah, so that I finished that more than a year ago, and unfortunately, I don't know yet when it's going to get released. But I met up with the director and the producer about a month or two ago. There was a slight change to the opening of the film, so I had to redo some of the music for that. So I know it's kind of thriller / horror genre movie, more thriller, I'd say. And so, a very exciting, scary score that I had to write for that. Shortly, I should know kind of when the release date is going to be for that movie.
Right, looking forward to it. What's next for you? Do you have what's in your pipeline?
Well, on the shorter term, there's quite a few projects that I'll be collaborating more with Rupert Gregson Williams, which has been a really awesome opportunity to again learn and kind of work on these bigger scale projects. He's currently working on an Adam Sandler comedy with Jennifer Aniston that I am writing additional music for, and he'll soon start work on this HBO series, Catherine the Great with Helen Mirren, which looks incredible. I think they're still shooting. I think they're just wrapping up the shoot in a couple of days, actually. It looks like I'll be able to kind of be part of his team on that one, and he has more stuff coming up next year too. So that collaboration has been a lot of fun. And then I'll be working with Steve Jablonsky on 2 of the movies he's currently working on, Wonderland and Bloodshot. So a lot of exciting stuff for the next couple of months. I think that's all, that goes all the way into May of next year that I'll be helping out on some exciting projects.
Very good. Sounds awesome. So you keep busy.
Yeah.
Sven, is there anything else on your mind? Anything else you would like to add to our conversation?
No. I think you got it pretty much covered. You did great preparation. As I wouldn't expect any less from you, Michael.
Thank you for this nice compliment. Means a lot to me. Sven, thanks for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate this, and I love talking to you again. And let's do another interview soon. Let's meet up soon, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, I did. It was fun. It's always fun, man. It was great talking to you.
Sven, I really appreciate it, and you take care, okay?
Okay, thanks, man. You too.
Bye-bye.
Good luck with everything. Yeah, bye.